In August 1978, 29-year-old traveling nurse Linda Porter checked into a small beachside motel near Clearwater, Florida. She had come off a stretch of night shifts along the Gulf, the kind of long, quiet hours spent watching monitors blink in dim rooms and walking softly past sleeping patients. The Seabreeze Motel sat low against a line of wind-stunted palms, with a rattling ice machine and a soda dispenser that ate quarters. Room 17 faced the parking lot and, if she left the blinds tilted just so, gave her a diagonal slice of sky that turned pink and then coral and then dark. She was last seen leaving her room to make a phone call, wearing her uniform and carrying her purse. She never returned. Her car was found in the parking lot, the room neat and undisturbed, the key missing from the rack. Police interviewed guests and the motel owner, but no leads ever surfaced. An officer took notes on a clipboard while the motel sign buzzed and threw a soft electric hum against the night. The owner, a plump man who kept his cigarettes in a glass ashtray shaped like a shell, said Linda had been polite, quiet, hardly there at all. A couple in room 12 remembered the swish of a uniform skirt and the smell of antiseptic. The maid said the bedspread in 17 had been folded back, shoes laid neatly beside it, purse gone with her. The phone by the lobby had an out-of-order tag and a scab of old gum beneath the coin return. There was another payphone up the road by the bait shop. None of it went anywhere. The days moved on. The heat held. The case cooled. For 45 years, the case remained unsolved, until 2023, when an estate auction in Tampa revealed an old keychain marked Room 17, Seabreeze Motel. The buyer, a collector of vintage items, recognized the motel name from a true crime podcast and reported it to authorities. He had lifted the key from a velvet tray of hardware and ephemera, brass door numbers, skeleton keys, a tin of watch springs, and felt the weight of it, the way the numbers had been stamped crooked by a hand that didn't care to be precise. He took it home, placed it on a white towel, and realized he'd seen that name before. The Seabreeze Motel, Room 17. He wrote to the podcast host. He called the sheriff's office. By the end of the week, the key lay inside an evidence bag on a table under LED lights while a tech in a lab coat leaned close. Forensic testing on the corroded metal revealed traces of blood, and inside the attached tag, hidden under a metal plate, was a fragment of cloth containing DNA matching Linda Porter. The plate had been crimped, then smoothed, as if someone had tried to hide a secret and then make it look untouched. A low-power scope revealed residue beneath the seam. A steady hand teased the metal back and found the folded triangle of cloth, thick with time and grime. It had the color of old bone, and it smelled faintly like pennies and mildew. The DNA profile took time, but not so much time as it once might have, and when the match pinged the system, a woman in a cardigan in a quiet room picked up the phone and called the detective handling cold cases that quarter. The detective stood at the window of a building that had once been a bank and held the receiver to his ear while the words came in measured tones. A match to Linda Porter. The fragment inside the key tag from Room 17. The Seabreeze Motel. Clearwater, 1978. The key had belonged to Thomas Greaves, a former motel handyman who had died in 2019. When investigators reopened his property records, they found a buried lockbox containing photos, personal items, and Linda's missing locket. Greaves had been the kind of man who fixed humming AC units, plunged overflowing toilets, and knew which rooms had doors that stuck in summer. In old notes, he had been described as reliable, always around, never far. He wore shirts with a thinning collar and carried a ring of keys that chimed when he walked. The day after Linda vanished, he had been seen coiling a green hose around his elbow and twisting it into a figure 8. Years later, he had moved north toward the state line and into a one-story house behind a stand of Australian pines. He lived alone. He died alone. His estate had been sold for back taxes and medical bills. His key ring, without meaning to anyone at the time, had slid into a box and then into another box, the way the past sometimes slid into the present when chance pushed it. Detective Nora Llewellyn had been a child when Linda Porter's missing poster curled on a bulletin board near the produce section of the grocery store, and yet she felt she knew Linda from how thoroughly the file had been compiled. The file smelled like a library. It contained typed memos and photographs with lightning-white flash burns in their corners, notes from callers who swore they'd seen a uniformed woman hitchhiking, a tip from a man who claimed to have found a purse near a drainage ditch that turned out to be a soda can beside a purse-shaped shadow. It contained the motel layout drawn in ballpoint on thin paper: lobby here, ice machine here, room 17 here. The detective spread everything across her desk and then across the conference table because her desk was not enough. The story waited. It had waited for decades. It had a key. She drove to where the Seabreeze had been, and where a real estate office now occupied the lot. The palms had grown taller and then been replaced. A photograph from 1978 showed the sign in block letters and a vacancy plaque that could be flipped with a finger. The office receptionist had a ring of silver keys on her desk, a small and ordinary echo. Nora walked the property lines as if the tiled floors still smelled like chlorine from the pool. She imagined Linda in August 1978, a 29-year-old traveling nurse who had checked into a small beachside motel near Clearwater, Florida, who had been last seen leaving room 17 to make a phone call wearing her uniform and carrying her purse. She imagined what heat felt like in a polyester blend. She imagined the flutter of coins in a palm. She imagined a woman who had grown used to moving through spaces unnoticed, quietly, like water. Witness reports from that night, in the old file, lived in a soft zone where memory and wish laid atop one another. The couple in room 12 said they heard the payphone's jangly coin return clack and then someone curse softly. A fisherman said he saw a woman by the bait shop phone up the road, a woman in white, head bent, the cord wrapped once around her wrist. The motel owner said he'd been in his office counting receipts, the key rack blinking like teeth in the dim. One of the keys, later, had not hung where it should have. But had that been noticed before or after the sheriff came? Another guest said a man had been arguing with someone near the pool. He thought it was a couple. He remembered the man's hands moving in sharp shapes, like he was cutting air into boxes. Thomas Greaves appeared in those old pages as a presence more than a person. A notation said he had worked there for 6 years by then, that he had started in late 1972, that he had repaired the vending machine with a bent paperclip once when candy bars jammed in the slot. He had a small shed where he kept tools. He had a drawer in the office where he kept extra screws, thick-lipped washers, discarded key rings, and a tarnished quarter flattened by a train. He had lived in a tiny studio behind the motel, near the alley where trucks backed in to deliver cases of soda and bleach. He had told the deputy he had gone to bed early that night. Early, he'd said. Early is when the day ends. The deputy had underlined that sentence as if it mattered. In 2023, an analyst compared the bite patterns in 2 small indentations along the metal edge of the room 17 tag and found they had been made by a standard pair of sheet metal snips, the kind kept in a handyman's shed in the 1970s. A second analyst measured the corroded smear near the rivet and detected hemoglobin. A third lifted a partial print from the inside surface where it had been protected from air and time. It came up faint and partial, but it leaned in the direction of Thomas Greaves. The lockbox from his buried property cache told the rest. He had chosen a place behind his bedroom where the pine needles fell thick and a neighbor's dog never went. The box held faded snapshots, a woman by a pool. A row of doors with 14, 15, 16 on them, and personal items that did not belong to him. A lighter engraved with initials that matched no one in the family. A single earring shaped like a drop of rain. And then, in a small velvet pouch, the locket Linda's sister remembered the most vividly, a tiny heart with a hairline scratch across its face where, as kids, they had dropped it on the kitchen tile and sworn not to tell their mother. When Nora called Linda's sister, now in her 70s, she kept her voice steady. She explained the key. She explained the cloth. She explained the locket. The sister breathed in as if the air itself had sharpened. She said she had kept a box of letters, the last one postmarked the week before August 1978, the one that said Linda had felt tired but relieved to be by the water for a few days. She said Linda had always called on Sundays. She said, after she stopped calling, their mother slept in Linda's room to feel the last heat her daughter had left in the sheets. The sister would drive down. She would bring the letters. She would bring the childhood photograph where they stood back to prove who had grown taller. The sheriff's office held a small press conference that felt like coming out of a tunnel. Microphones picked up the word key again and again. The reporters wrote it. The anchors said it in the 6 p.m. tone reserved for tragedies that had finally acquired a shape. After 45 years, the mystery of the Motel Key was finally solved. The words felt neat, like a bow tied once and done, but for the detective who had fanned the file into a circle on her table, and for the sister who held the locket like it might still be warm, the solution lived less in a headline than in a series of rooms finally unlocked with a key that had been twisting in the dark for decades. Back in 1978, the Seabreeze had the polite, public privacy of a place that did not ask questions. Linda Porter had checked in under her own name, signed the ledger in careful script, carried a small suitcase and a nurse's bag with pens and a folded stethoscope. She had walked to the office twice for ice. She had called her agency from the payphone, records later showed, to confirm her next shift 2 days later at a facility north of town. She had eaten a late meal in her room, a salad container, plastic fork in the trash, a small paper cup with the spiked lid from the ice machine resting upside down like a helmet. The maid remembered how neat she'd been. The maid pointed to the way the corners of the bedspread had been squared. A nurse would do that, she had said. Only a nurse would do that on her day off. The handyman's shed held answers that would have been simple, had anyone looked hard enough at the time, but they had looked and still not seen. In photographs, a pegboard showed the outline of tools like ghosts of their own shapes. A hammer hung slightly off by one nail. There were 2 sets of snips. The smaller set had a burr that matched the mark on the key tag recovered in 2023. There was a canvas apron with a smear of something coppery on it that no one swabbed because back then there had been no sense to swab everything, because back then everything had been more expensive to test, because back then the line between useful and noise had been thicker. The shed's window looked toward the alley. At night, a rectangle of light fell onto the dust like a fallen door. A man could have watched. A man could have noticed a woman in a white uniform crossing that rectangle, moving toward the payphone by the road, purse on her shoulder, coins in her hand. The collector who found the key at the Tampa estate auction sat in the back row the day the sheriff's office returned Linda's locket to her sister. He did not speak. He watched the way the locket lay in a gloved palm and then moved into the sister's fingers and then sat against her chest as if it had found its original place. He thought of the velvet tray and how easily he could have passed the key by, how easily the key could have gone to someone who did not listen to true crime podcasts during long drives, who would not have felt the itch along the scalp that whispers, that name. That motel, that room. He had bought the box for the tin of Watch Springs. He had ended up with a map back to a summer night on the Gulf Coast. The motel owner, long dead now, had once told a deputy he'd hired Thomas Greaves because Greaves never lost things. Greaves kept lists. Greaves kept duplicates of lists. Greaves always put the keys back on their hooks. The irony kept circling in the detective's mind, that the one thing most closely associated with Room 17 had left the board and hid for 45 years with the man who prided himself on order. Order had been his screen. Order had been his alibi. Interviews with those who had known Greaves painted a narrow but textured portrait, a man who drank exactly 2 beers and never a third, who stacked lumber flush against the wall, who got angry in a tight way instead of a loud way, who stood too close when he handed you a wrench. A niece remembered that he had given her a charm bracelet one Christmas and it had included a tiny key. She had thought it meant he wanted her to have a door to the world. She had been 12. She had slept with it under her pillow until the key bit her cheek and she woke with a faint red crescent by her mouth. Years later she realized he had always given things that meant something to him but never explained what. He had been all symbols, no translations. In the reopened case file, Nora wrote a new timeline alongside the old one, ink in a different color, the way a historian annotates a margin with the benefit of hindsight. She drew the path from room 17 to the lobby to the road with the payphone and back again. She marked where a person could have been waiting unlit by the pool pump shed, where a person could have moved without being seen from the rooms. She added the auditory landscape, the ice machine's clatter, the gulls, the thin slap of water against the seawall, the hiss of the soda vending machine's compressor. She wrote what could now be said with evidence: the keychain from room 17 had been in the possession of Thomas Greaves. The tag had concealed a cloth fragment carrying Linda Porter's DNA. A lockbox buried behind Greaves's house had contained Linda's missing locket and other items kept like tokens. She wrote, too, the words that were truer than the press release: solved did not mean simple. Solved did not mean not sad. Solved did not mean finished. Linda's letters, brought down by her sister in a neat stack bound with 2 rubber bands gone brittle with age, showed a voice that matched the tidy room and the squared bedspread corners. She wrote about the ridiculousness of the soda machine that required a tug downward and a shove upward at the same time. She wrote about a patient who called her Angel because he could not remember her name. She wrote about the motel sign's ancient buzz. She wrote about a stray cat that lurked by the dumpster and that she fed with the leftover tuna from a sandwich. She wrote about the August light in Clearwater, how it made the world look like someone had wiped it with oil. She did not write about fear. She did not write about any man. She did not write about being followed. The absence itself became a kind of presence. In a back room at the sheriff's office, the evidence techs laid the lockbox contents in a careful grid. A photo of the pool, the water milky with flash. A photo of a door with a crooked number. 3 keys with their tags filed down to shine, their numbers obliterated. The locket. A strip of motel stationery with room 17 impressed on it by a hard pen pressed through a previous page. The stationery had a watermark only visible when held to the light. The watermark showed a gull with its wings out and the words Seabreeze, like a home by the sea. Someone had placed a coffee cup on the gull's wing and left a circle of brown. Beneath the circle, a fingerprint spiraled. It was partial, but it had the same leaning loops as the one beneath the tag plate. The bait shop up the road had long ago turned into a smoothie bar. The payphone had been ripped out and the bolt holes filled, repainted to the color of summer fruit. A woman who had worked there in the 80s, interviewed now as a nostalgic novelty, said there had been a night when a man came in with wet cuffs and asked to use the bathroom. She had handed him a key attached to a plank of wood so that no one would pocket it. He had not come back. She had knocked. She had found the window unlatched, the key on the sink, a crescent of water on the floor and a smear on the doorframe that looked like rust. Nora walked the edges between what could be proven and what could be felt. She looked for other women who had checked in and checked out of memory the way Linda had. She looked for reports of lost small items that never resurfaced: earrings, lockets, little things a man might keep in a box because he wanted evidence that he had touched a life. She found 2 more names attached to nights with similar shapes: a traveler between cities, a nurse between shifts, and she marked them in her file with pencil because she knew the difference between suspicion and proof. Still, when she closed her eyes, she saw 3 doors with the numbers misaligned and a key in a man's pocket that did not belong there. At a small gathering under a live oak, Linda's sister spoke about the August of 1978 as if it were a place one could still visit. She said she had waited by the phone until the waiting became its own kind of life. She said the line in the newspaper that said she never returned had been accurate and also not, because Linda did return in the stories they told to keep her alive, in the way they saved a seat at Thanksgiving without announcing why. She held up the locket. The tiny heart caught the light. She said the words again: in August 1978, 29-year-old traveling nurse Linda Porter checked into a small beachside motel near Clearwater, Florida. She spoke them like a psalm. The people around her nodded. They knew the rest. She was last seen leaving her room to make a phone call, wearing her uniform and carrying her purse. She never returned. They knew the car and the room and the missing key. They knew the decades. They knew the estate auction in Tampa in 2023. They knew the keychain marked room 17, Seabreeze Motel. They knew how a corroded plate had concealed a cloth fragment, how DNA had matched, how the key had belonged to Thomas Greaves, the handyman who died in 2019, how his buried lockbox had given back the locket. They knew, too, that after 45 years, the mystery of the motel key was finally solved. And they also knew that solved did not erase the first sentence. It only let them say it without breaking. In the weeks that followed, the sheriff's office archived the file with a new sticker on the spine. The detective kept a photocopy of the motel's ledger page in her drawer, the one where Linda had written her name on the line in a careful hand that did not press too hard. When she closed her eyes, Nora still heard the clink of a key ring and the distant knock of waves against a low wall. She imagined the payphone, the tug and clink of coins, the rotary dial turning with 12 soft clicks and then the hard stop. She imagined Linda taking a breath before the first hello. She imagined a figure in the corner of the lot where the light did not reach. She imagined, most of all, the small, ordinary weight of room 17's key in a palm, a weight that had once been nothing and then had been everything, the hinge around which a story turned, the sound of brass on brass like a bell struck softly and then again. In the weeks after the press conference, Nora found herself returning to the same sentence as if it were a shoreline she had to walk again and again until her feet knew every pebble. In August 1978, 29-year-old traveling nurse Linda Porter checked into a small beachside motel near Clearwater, Florida. She was last seen leaving her room to make a phone call, wearing her uniform and carrying her purse. She never returned. It was an anchor, but it hadn't stopped the tide. The estate auction in Tampa, the old keychain marked Room 17, Seabreeze Motel, the forensic testing that lifted blood from corroded metal and a folded cloth bearing DNA matching Linda Porter, the discovery that the key had belonged to Thomas Greaves, the former motel handyman who died in 2019, and the lockbox buried behind his house with photos. Personal items, and Linda's missing locket, those were waypoints on a map that now kept extending. A week after returning the locket to Linda's sister, Nora got a call from a retiree named Walt Hanover who had once worked for the telephone company, back when Clearwater's calls hummed through switching frames like bees. He spoke slowly, like a man trying not to bump something fragile with his words. Back then, he said, payphones had a habit of keeping a little ghost in the line if someone jimmied the coin return. We logged certain faults. You're asking about August 78. There was a service ticket out by the bait shop. Fault code 4 stuck trip means the line thought the call never finished. Nora drove to a storage facility on the edge of town where Walt kept his old binders. The walls inside his unit were made of corrugated metal, and a fan oscillated with a soft mechanical complaint. He pulled a box forward that smelled like paper and early mornings. We kept microfiche copies of fault tickets, he said, sliding a plastic sleeve under a lamp. The strip glowed amber. He traced a row with his finger. Here. August 12, 1978. Payphone line 727-555-7190. Stuck trip after completion to local. It notes a destination number. Not who answered, just the number. He read it to her. It wasn't the nursing agency. It wasn't Linda's sister. It wasn't an out-of-state long distance. It was a local line that had since gone dead. Nora typed it into her phone, knowing it would not connect, then ran it through the archive back at the office. The number belonged, in 1978, to a house registered under a name she did not recognize, an older woman who had rented rooms to seasonal laborers, and then, in 1979, the line was assigned to a yard behind the Seabreeze used for storage, listed under business services in the motel's name. That yard backed up to the maintenance shed. She looked at the photocopied ledger from the Seabreeze, room 17 signed in Linda's neat hand. Below it, the slanted signature of a salesman in room 18. Above it, a smear where someone had dragged a palm across wet ink. Nora imagined Linda at the payphone dropping coins, dialing the agency, confirming a shift. She imagined Linda hearing a click, another call coming into the payphone, or a cut-in on the line. These things happened. Or she imagined something simpler, finishing with the agency, then dialing a local number she'd been given, maybe by the owner, maybe by a guest, to check on something, a ride, a recommendation, a second call to the same lot, to the same place where the man who kept keys also kept lines of sight. A letter from Linda's sister mentioned that Linda had been looking for a laundromat that would bleach her uniforms without shredding them. The maid at the Seabreeze, tracked down now in a small condo decorated with shells and crocheted afghans, said there had been a rumor. The handyman could get you into the motel's industrial machines after hours if you were kind about it. He made himself useful, the maid said, tugging her cardigan closed though the room was warm. Useful men don't raise alarms. He'd fix things before you noticed they were broken. Nora combed through Greaves's records again. Property deeds. An old P.O. box he'd kept downtown. A payment to a storage unit in Tarpon Springs that no one had flagged because the rental had been under a misspelling, Greaves with 2 E's. The unit had fallen dormant after his death. The facility had tried to auction it twice and failed for lack of bidders. The manager handed Nora a clipboard and snapped the roll-up door. The air had that particular storage smell of dust, cardboard, and something that used to be new. There were 4 wooden drawers stacked like a cube, each with brass pulls. Inside, coiled like snakes in a museum case, lay old motel key tags, dozens of them, maybe 100, some with numbers filed down, some intact. She lifted one at random, 14, Seadrift Cottages. Another, 33, Palmetto Inn. Several were blank where the numbers had been sanded into anonymity, the metal nearly polished by the act. At the bottom of the 3rd drawer, a shallow tray held a Polaroid, a door with 17 stamped crooked. A faint smear running from the 7 like a tear. Behind the drawer sat 3 spiral notebooks wrapped in wax paper. Nora boxed them and carried them to the car like cake. In the office evidence room, she untied the string and turned the first one open. Greaves's handwriting ran small, regular, heavily indented on the left, as if he had wanted to fence his words in. The early pages recorded repairs, AC 12 shutter/compressor oil seeps/replaced belt. Then, in a new section with no label, he had listed dates and single adjectives, each on its own line. June 3rd, quiet. June 16th, careful. July 1st, neat. August 12th, angel. The word sat in the middle of the page like a hot coin. He had written angel again on a back flap, once larger, the ink pressed so hard it left a valley in the paper. The notebook continued, moved. North. Sold. Returned key. There were numbers. He had kept a numerical log of key tags by weight. He had weighed them on a postal scale and noted the variance as if weight itself meant something to him that language could not hold. The second notebook was cluttered with maps drawn in ink, layouts of small lodgings along the Gulf, arrows indicating sightlines from office windows, shaded rectangles where one could stand in darkness and see without being seen. The names matched the tags: Seadrift Cottages, Palmetto Inn, Seabreeze. Some had little X marks by the laundry rooms. Some had circles near the payphones. On the inside back cover, a single phrase in block letters: return what is kept. Beneath it, a list of items: bracelet, coin, photo, hairpin, locket. Each had a check next to it, as if he had once made an inventory and then gone about giving things back into the ground, not to the people. The third notebook held what Nora had hoped and also not hoped to find: Polaroids tucked between pages like pressed leaves. Most were of doors, indifferent, ordinary doors, all that was visible of a room's whole life. A few were of pool tiles, zoomed in so close that grout was geography. One, off-center and caught in motion blur, showed a woman in a white uniform crossing a stripe of light. The date on the border read August 12, 1978. Her face was turned away, you could see only the sweep of hair, the line of the purse strap. The brightness along the hem matched the sheen of polyester in heat. Nora closed the notebook and set her palms flat against it because her hands needed somewhere to go. The sheriff's office authorized a careful inventory of the key tags. A few still held their riveted plates. One, when teased open by the lab tech who had found the cloth inside the room 17 tag, revealed a thumbnail-sized piece of ruled paper folded to nothing, stained with oil. The writing, so faint Nora had to squint, said, 17/Angel. The plate carried a trace of old blood in its seam. Another tag, 14, Seadrift Cottages, held a sliver of something like thread, too degraded to test. A third held nothing at all. The tags became a chorus, some sang, some were mute, all together made a sound that felt like wind through a rack of thin metal. News trickled out again. After 45 years, the mystery of the Motel Key was finally solved, the headlines had already said, and yet reporters found new angles, an expanded pattern, a map of little Gulf motels, a handyman who kept notebooks like ledger books of the smallest sins. Families who had their own Augusts and Septembers reached out. A woman whose mother had disappeared in 1976 from a cottage in Indian Rocks walked into the lobby one afternoon and stood in front of Nora's desk without speaking. Nora knew that look now. It was made of hope and dread set muzzle to muzzle. Nora offered a chair. She offered water. She offered the only true thing she had, "We will look." Nora went back to Linda's letters. She read them as if they contained a code. The joke about the soda machine and the tune she said it played when it got stuck. The cat by the dumpster. The way she had written the word okay 3 times on a line when she was reassuring her sister. She had the practical kindness of a person who had changed dressings and taught patients how to breathe through pain. It made the word angel in the handyman's notebook feel stolen. He had taken a word other people had given Linda and uses for himself like a tag, a label he could pin on and keep. In August 1978, the 29-year-old traveling nurse had been last seen leaving her room to make a phone call wearing her uniform and carrying her purse. She had made a call. The line had faltered as if it clung to her voice. She never returned. The property where the Seabreeze had stood kept giving up corners. The real estate office had a crawlspace no one used. The electrician called Nora after finding a narrow gap behind a misplaced wall panel. Inside, dusty and undisturbed, lay a small metal box the size of a loaf of bread, unlatched, likely forgotten in the confusion of renovations years ago. The box held old ledgers and a handful of motel stationery sheets, most blank. At the bottom, creased into a paper tent, lay a note written in an unsteady hand: "If 17 asks for after-hours laundry, page me." T. It wasn't a smoking gun, just a routine, a way of interleaving himself into the patterns of people who needed to wash their uniforms and catch sleep between shifts. The owner had granted him small privileges, he had made those privileges into paths. Grief's niece came in again, the one with the charm bracelet. She had remembered something else. A summer when she was 10, he had taken her to a motel pool on a day the sign said, "Closed for maintenance." He had let her dip her feet in while he worked. He liked rules, she said, frowning at the word. He liked making them. He liked breaking them in secret. Then he'd hold the secret like a coin under his tongue. She touched the locket on Linda's sister's chest with her eyes but not her hand, the way you look at something holy that is also made of metal and clasp. The estate auction buyer, the collector who had recognized the name Seabreeze Motel on the keychain in 2023, began to help Nora on his own time. He had a gift for knowing which dead storage units held stories and which held only old advertising banners and water-stained recliners. He took photos of key tags in junk shops and sent them to Nora at odd hours. He found one stamped with 33, Palmetto in a box of postcards at a flea market, the rivet bent like a wink. Nora picked it up in person, cradled it on her palm like an egg. The lab opened it with the same patient tool and the same breath held. Nothing. Not everything would speak. A schoolteacher from the 80s sent Nora a picture of a yearbook page where Coach of the Year, 1984, had been printed under a photo in another county. It had nothing to do with the Seabreeze, not really, but the teacher wrote that the gym in that town had once had a locker sealed behind a row of newer ones, and she had not stopped thinking of locks and keys. People stitched their own tapestries out of the scraps presented to them. Nora filed the email in a folder labeled Good Intentions. The internet had made everyone part of a cold case unit, for better or worse. Nora's supervisor asked if she ever slept. She did, but in fits, and always with the sound in her head of coins falling in a metal throat. She returned to August 1978 again and again, not to relive the event, but to watch it under different weather, from different corners, the way you test a story for fractures by rolling it in your hands. Linda Porter checked into room 17 at the Seabreeze Motel near Clearwater, Florida. The room was neat and undisturbed. Her car was in the lot. The key was missing from the rack. Police interviewed guests and the owner, but no leads surfaced. For 45 years, nothing. Then, in 2023, the estate auction in Tampa, the old keychain marked Room 17, Seabreeze Motel. Forensic testing revealed blood on the corroded metal and a hidden cloth fragment with DNA matching Linda. The key had belonged to Thomas Greaves, the handyman who died in 2019. Property records reopened, a buried lockbox held photos, personal items, and Linda's missing locket. After 45 years, the mystery of the motel key was finally solved. The sentence was true and insufficient. Truth is often like that, flat on the page and thunderous under the surface. One afternoon, Linda's sister brought in a small envelope. "I found this in my mother's things," she said. Inside lay a photograph the size of a playing card. Two girls stood back to back in a kitchen. The younger one was Linda, grinning as if inches mattered like years. On the back, in their mother's tidy script, a note: "The locket arrived 12th birthday. For luck." The date made Nora stop. 12 years old. If you turned that into a number, the way Greaves turned things into numbers, you got anniversaries. You got rituals. You got a man who might have liked the neatness of a locket given at 12 returning, in his mind, to the number when he decided to keep it for himself. On August 12, 1978, Linda had been last seen. The number swam, 12. 12, 12. Walt from the telephone company called again. "One more thing," he said. "The fault ticket?" It had a notation from the tech who went out the next morning. He wrote, "Coin return sticky with something like syrup." Walt laughed without humor. People poured soda in the return to try to fish coins out. But if it was syrupy at dawn after sea air all night, well. Could be blood. Could be rust. Could be both. Small, ordinary details that meant little then constructed a shape now, like dots in a sky you draw lines between until a constellation appears. Nora drove out to the seawall with Linda's sister at sunset. The gulls floated like paper cutouts. They did not speak for a while. Then Linda's sister said, not as a question, "You think he watched?" Nora said, "Yes." The older woman nodded. She had stopped asking why a long time ago. Why had turned into a shape that did not fit in her mouth. "He kept things that didn't belong to him," she said. "He kept her key. He kept her locket. He kept words that were hers." "Angel." She said the last like a taste she wanted gone. A month later, the storage unit in Tarpon Springs yielded one more surprise, a narrow cardboard mailer tucked behind the drawers, sealed with yellowing tape. Inside was a strip of negatives. The images, once inverted, showed a sequence at the Seabreeze's laundry room door. First, the door ajar. Then, a hand holding it wider. Then, a dark hall and a white edge moving through it. The final frame was black as if the camera had been pocketed too fast. The hand's knuckles were abraded. On the rise of one knuckle, the glint of a key's tooth. The lab dated the film stock to the late 70s. It wasn't proof on its own, but like everything else, it was another bead slid onto the same string. The Seadrift Cottages tag made Nora drive north along the coast. The cottages had been painted mint green and were now a yoga retreat with succulents in terracotta pots. The owner, gracious and weary of old stories, let Nora look at the old ledger book they kept in a glass case for charm. 2 rooms had no records for June 1976, and a line had been torn out by the spine like a page plucked. A woman named Esther who ran the desk then had passed away years before, but her daughter remembered an incident. A nurse came through in the summer. She ironed her uniforms. Something about her made me think of my aunt who always remembered everyone's names. She left the next morning, I thought. My mother said not to ask questions about guests. "We provide rooms, not stories," she said. The phrase lodged in Nora like a burr. Provide rooms, not stories. And yet, rooms became stories when people vanished out of them and the key refused to go back on the board. Back at the office, the collector sent Nora a late-night photo, a key tag from a shop in Dunedin stamped Cabana 5, Sunset Shores. He had photographed it on the glass countertop where the clerk had spread antique spoons. Could be nothing, he texted. Could be something. Nora's world had become that, a landscape of could be, anchored by the shape of one night when the could be turned into was. In August 1978, Linda Porter checked into a small beachside motel near Clearwater. She was last seen leaving her room to make a phone call in her uniform, carrying her purse. She never returned. Her car stayed. The room stayed. The key went missing. For 45 years, the case remained unsolved. In 2023, an estate auction in Tampa, an old keychain marked Room 17, Seabreeze Motel. Blood traces on corroded metal. A hidden cloth with DNA matching Linda. The key belonged to Thomas Greaves, a handyman who died in 2019. A buried lockbox with photos, personal items, and Linda's missing locket. After 45 years, the mystery of the motel key was finally solved. And yet, solved did not end the road, it only lit it. Nora started a board, not the cliché with strings, but a clean grid of motel names and dates, each cell filling with scraps, a note about a laundry room, a key tag with a particular burr, a map with a shaded corner. She did not write victim anywhere on it. She wrote only names and dates and distances, because words like victim made the grid feel like a cage when she wanted it to be a window. She added a column for returned items. The locket sat there, a single, shining entry, impossible and undeniable. She visited the bait shop's old lot again, the one that had become a smoothie place with tubs of mango pulp and a glossy chalkboard menu. The owner let her walk around back with a cup of water. The bolt holes where the payphone had been looked like scars in the stucco. She touched the wall. Her fingertip came away dusty. She thought about a young woman standing there on an August night, dialing by memory, listening to the line click and then open, saying hello in that tired, clear nurse's voice. She thought about a man in a dark corner with a key ring that sounded like a small bell when he moved. She thought about the ordinary, terrible closeness of all that, how the difference between safety and danger could be a square of light on the ground. Linda's sister visited Room 17's footprint in daylight, pale cement in a strip of shade beside the real estate office. She stood with her shoes just shy of where a threshold might have been and told the air what she had told Nora, that her sister had squared the corners of the bedspread, had fed a stray cat, had written OK 3 times in a row when she was reassuring someone she loved. She did not say goodbye. She said, "I'm here," as if Linda might answer. Somewhere a key clinked, in someone else's pocket, in the hand of a realtor locking up for the night, in memory. The sound traveled farther than it had any right to. Not long after, the lab called with a result that made the room go quiet around Nora the way it does when you put your head under water. The partial print lifted from beneath the metal plate inside the Room 17 key tag, the print that had leaned in the direction of Greaves, had a match to a full-rolled print taken from him in 1985 when he applied to be a security guard at a marina and failed the background check for reasons unrelated. It was thin evidence by courtroom standards, but the courtroom had already closed for him, he was 6 years in the ground. It was thick enough for narrative, thick enough to stitch into the fabric of a night you could not otherwise touch. It made a shape you could hold up and say, this, here, this press of lines and skin, this ridge and whirl, this was on the inside of the tag that held the cloth that held the cells that held Linda's story. Nora didn't sleep that night. She pulled the notebooks back out and read them like someone decoding a prayer for the 1000th time. The words did not change. Her understanding did. "Return what is kept," he had written. It struck her then that he had not returned anything to anyone. He had returned objects to the ground, to boxes, to silence, returned them only in the sense that a thief who buries the ring he cannot wear makes a ceremony out of his guilt. He had turned motels into rituals and keys into talismans. He had taken an August night and carried it with him in the metal weight of a tag. Morning slid along the blinds. Nora texted the collector a single line, "Sea drift first." He replied with a photo from his car at dawn, the cottages under a pale sky, a hand-drawn arrow pointing to a shed that had been painted the same mint green. Owner says there's a floorboard that feels hollow, he wrote. We'll get permission. We'll be gentle. Nora nodded to no one. The grid on her wall had a new cell to fill, and beyond it, a horizon of small places where people once slept and left and, sometimes, did not. She stood at the window with her coffee and said it aloud again. Because names and facts were a kind of blessing, in August 1978, 29-year-old traveling nurse Linda Porter checked into a small beachside motel near Clearwater, Florida. She was last seen leaving her room to make a phone call, wearing her uniform and carrying her purse. She never returned. Her car was found in the parking lot, the room neat and undisturbed, the key missing from the rack. Police interviewed guests and the motel owner, but no leads ever surfaced. For 45 years, the case remained unsolved, until 2023, when an estate auction in Tampa revealed an old keychain marked Room 17, Seabreeze Motel. Forensic testing on the corroded metal revealed traces of blood, and inside the attached tag, hidden under a metal plate, was a fragment of cloth containing DNA matching Linda Porter. The key had belonged to Thomas Greaves, a former motel handyman who had died in 2019. When investigators reopened his property records, they found a buried lockbox containing photos, personal items, and Linda's missing locket. After 45 years, the mystery of the motel key was finally solved. She breathed, and then moved. The door to the day opened. The board with its squares waited. The cottages waited. The shed with the hollow-sounding board waited. Greaves's notebooks lay on the table like stones taken from a river, each one holding the cold of water. The key from room 17 lay in its bag, a small, terrible weight that had dragged a whole story up from the bottom. Somewhere out there, an old tag stamped 14, Seadrift Cottages, had more to say. Somewhere, a rivet held a secret the size of a seed. Somewhere, a clerk in 1976 had watched a woman in a white uniform buy a roll of quarters and had not known she was watching a life go from one room to another with the ease of a breath. Nora took her notes and her keys and stepped into the humid Florida light that made the world look oiled and new, and the long work that followed any headline, unfurled ahead of her like a road. The floorboard at Seadrift Cottages lifted with a brittle sigh, as if the wood itself had been holding breath for decades. The owner had signed the permission paperwork with steady hands. Nora had thanked her and promised care. Under the board lay a pocket of space lined with tar paper and an old towel laid neatly flat, as if someone had once believed neatness could launder what had been done. On the towel sat three things: a small brass key tag with its number filed away to shine, a cheap lady's watch stopped at 2:11, and, wrapped in waxed paper, a postcard of Clearwater Beach at sunset, the shoreline washed in sherbet colors. Someone had pressed the wax paper so tight that the silhouette of the pier impressed into the postcard's gloss. The back of the card carried a single number in pencil. Nora recognized it, the payphone by the old bait shop, the one that logged a stuck trip on August 12, 1978. The lab opened the key tag with the same gloved patience they had given the room 17 tag from the Seabreeze Motel. Nothing sat beneath this plate but a stain that reacted faintly to heme tests, the ghost of a trace, a memory's memory. Enough to say it had been held by living hands when something sharp happened nearby. Enough to say a person had turned keys into reliquaries for moments he never earned. Nora traced the pencil number on the postcard with her thumb and thought of paths, how every object that surfaced seemed to lay down a line between small places on the Gulf. She pinned a photo of the board to her grid and drew an arrow to a new note: drainage line behind old Seabreeze footprint, original plan? She reopened the county records and found a forgotten sheet rolled into blueprint microfilm, its corners furred with age. The Seabreeze's original layout included a laundry drain that ran under the maintenance shed to a cistern built from stacked concrete rings. In the late 80s, the site had been replumbed, the cistern capped with fill, and the new pipes tied to the municipal line. The cap had been poured haphazardly, a patch in an old quilt. A survey crew brought a ground-penetrating radar rig to the lot behind the real estate office. The machine did not reveal bones like a photograph. It painted anomalous shapes where the Earth's uniformity broke. Under the rectangle where the maintenance shed had once stood, a round void glowed on their screen, the ghost of a well. The crew chief rapped the ground with his knuckles and heard the faint hollowness he lived to hear. When the cap came off, the air that bloomed up smelled like old iron and damp paper. The concrete rings descended into shadow, their inner surfaces slick. A rope ladder went down. Nora watched the tech ease into darkness with a headlamp that cut a clean circle on ancient water stains. At the bottom lay a bed of silt and debris, bottle caps, a lid from a coffee tin, 2 flattened washers, and the rounded corner of a leather wallet long collapsed into itself. The tech bagged everything. The last thing he lifted lay heavy for its size. It turned in his hand and flashed dull, metal gone almost black. He looked up. "Tag," he said. Another tag. It bore no number, just the faint oval where a number had been eaten away with sandpaper. The plate was riveted shut. In the lab, under a hood, the tech teased the plate up from its oxidized lip. A flake of textile clung to the underside like a moth wing. This time, there was no blood left to test. But behind the flake lay a single hair, bent in an arc, caught and forgotten by time. It came away under static. Rooted hair could gift a profile. Rootless hair gave less, but it held enough to align. The partial mitochondrial result leaned toward Linda's maternal line, the same line already tied by the cloth fragment in the room 17 tag. It was not courtroom proof, it was spine-deep confirmation that the man who had kept a key from the rack had fed more than one secret into the dark mouth of a cistern. The workers drained the cistern a foot at a time, careful, methodical. At the bottom, beneath sediment, the shovel's lip rang against something that was not concrete. They cleared around it with their hands. The shape came slow, curves and hollows, until it resolved into what Nora had expected and still felt buckled to see: bone, patient and pale. The remains had collapsed inward on themselves over time, gathered by gravity. There were no shoes, no fabric left to name, only small, mute proofs, the arc of a jaw, the clasped arrangement of wrists that said more than any photograph ever could. No gore. No spectacle. Just the quiet insistence of what endures when someone tries to erase a person and fails because the world, stubborn as it is, holds records in dirt and iron. They halted. They called the medical examiner. The recovery team worked under a tent for shade, each movement documented, each sliver of silt brushed back as if it were parchment. Dental records still existed, if incomplete. A nurse took care of her teeth because she had to smile for the healing of others. X-rays matched features so particular they read like a signature: root shape, a tiny chip on the edge of an incisor Linda had once joked about in a letter when she bit an ice cube wrong. DNA from the small remnant in the key tag's cloth had already matched Linda's. Now, bone aligned with paper, and paper aligned with memory. The call to Linda's sister went out with the compassion and certainty this kind of work owes. The older woman sat down as if a hand had pressed her gently toward a chair. She said thank you 4 times and then said Linda's name, not to Nora but to the space in front of her. Nora stood at the edge of the open cistern and pictured the night. It was not a reenactment, it was a discipline. She stripped out the cinematic and left the plausible: a man with a key ring that chimed when he walked, a woman in a white uniform who had squared the corners of a bedspread and fed a stray cat, a payphone with a sticky coin return, the sound of a laundry machine tumbling cloth into readiness for morning. He had made himself useful, and usefulness had been the dispatch he wrote for himself, the way he stood close to need and turned it into access. He had known the lines of shadow, the angles of sight. He had known the hollow the ground would keep. His notebooks had coined a phrase: return what is kept, and he had practiced it his way: not return to the rightful hands, but return to a mute place that would keep his theft out of daylight. Except the ground does not forget. The earth is a ledger if you know how to read its lines. The medical examiner offered specifics that were clinical and respectful. There were no marks of bone that told a detailed story: soft tissues tell those, and soft tissues go. But a single hyoid horn was fractured. It could have been a post-mortem break. It could have been the sign of a hand where a hand never had any right to be. The report stuck to what it could say. Nora did the same. The notebooks, the key tags, the partial print inside the room 17 tag, the lockbox, the locket, the drainage line, the cistern, the remains, it made a chain that did not ask for more links to be strong. The sheriff's office called a second press conference, quieter than the first, held in a room that once had been a bank lobby and still carried an echo if you clapped. The podium held printed words that had been manipulated by no one and touched by many. Reporters asked if the office would bring charges if Thomas Greaves were alive. Nora answered yes, and the room felt a ripple of something like relief. Reporters asked if there were other cases. Nora said there were other key tags, other motel names, and they were following each thread with care. Reporters asked about the locket. Linda's sister had worn it under her blouse on a chain that had belonged to their mother. She touched it once when the cameras leaned forward for their close-breathed feed. The collector who had bought the key at the Tampa estate auction stood in the back again, a witness to consequences he had never expected when he lifted a tarnished tag from a velvet tray. Later, outside, he told Nora he had started carrying a cheap, blank key tag in his pocket as a reminder that ordinary objects could be doors. He laughed at himself and then did not. He asked if it was appropriate to attend the service. Nora said yes. He said he would bring flowers that grew near seawalls, the kind that looked like stars fallen into sand. Linda's sister planned the service under a live oak because shade felt right in Florida. A small stack of letters tied with new ribbons sat on a table beside the photo of two girls back-to-back in a kitchen, measuring height with each other as if the future were a ribbon to be cut. The minister spoke, but it was the sister's voice that held the day. She recited the story not as a news item but as a family oath, her cadence steady, her memory meticulous. In August 1978, 29-year-old traveling nurse Linda Porter checked into a small beachside motel near Clearwater, Florida. She was last seen leaving her room to make a phone call, wearing her uniform and carrying her purse. She never returned. Her car was found in the parking lot, the room neat and undisturbed, the key missing from the rack. Police interviewed guests and the motel owner, but no leads ever surfaced. For 45 years, the case remained unsolved, until 2023, when an estate auction in Tampa revealed an old keychain marked Room 17, Seabreeze Motel. Forensic testing on the corroded metal revealed traces of blood, and inside the attached tag, hidden under a metal plate, was a fragment of cloth containing DNA matching Linda Porter. The key had belonged to Thomas Greaves, a former motel handyman who had died in 2019. When investigators reopened his property records, they found a buried lockbox containing photos, personal items, and Linda's missing locket. After 45 years, the mystery of the motel key was finally solved. She said those last words with gratitude and with the knowledge that solved did not mean undone. After the service, Nora walked the edge of the lot where the Seabreeze had stood and looked at the square of new concrete that now capped the cistern, this time with a plaque set in its face, the letters shallow but permanent, for Linda. For all who need a key returned. A small cluster of flowers had been set in a jar beside it, their stems green against the glass. The real estate office closed early that day. The receptionist gathered her ring of silver keys away from her desk, the metal little moons in a pocket. The sound they made, faint and ordinary, felt both harmless and weighted now, like the soft thud of a book closed on a chapter you had read too closely to forget. Back at her desk, Nora archived the grid. She made room for new squares. She slid the 3 notebooks into a box and labeled it with his name and then, in smaller letters, with hers. She kept a photocopy of Linda's ledger signature in the top drawer, not as a talisman but as a true thing to touch when the next case bled into ambiguity. The Room 17 key remained sealed in evidence, a quiet piece of brass that had dragged a truth through 45 years of silt. In the end, it had returned to a hook, not the motel's board, but a steel peg in a climate-controlled room where stories waited to be told correctly. The difference mattered. When Nora finally slept, she slept as if she had come in from weather. In the morning she woke to the sound of gulls that had learned to live with parking lots. She made coffee, opened the file one last time, and let her eyes rest on the first sentence again, not out of compulsion now but out of respect. In August 1978, 29-year-old traveling nurse Linda Porter checked into a small beachside motel near Clearwater, Florida. She had stood in a square of light and dialed a number she knew. She had squared the corners of a bedspread. She had fed a stray cat. She had worn a locket scratched by childhood. She had vanished into a gap built by a man who believed order was a mask. And then, in 2023, a key had surfaced, and a tag had split, and a long, patient set of hands had put a shape to what had been refused shape for too long. After 45 years, the mystery of the motel key had been solved. It did not bring triumph. It brought a steadying of breath, a lifting of weight from the shoulders of those who had stood in doorways waiting for footsteps. It brought a place to lay flowers and a date to carve cleanly into stone. It brought, at last, the smallest and most human of restitutions, a return. A key gone missing had found its hook. A sister had found the ground to speak to. A story had found its ending, not with a flourish, but with the quiet click of brass against brass, the sound a room makes when the right door finally closes and, beyond it, the tide keeps its ordinary, merciful rhythm against the shore.